Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for coming so early. It's my great pleasure to introduce Petr Turecek, I did it wrong, as EHBEA's new investigator for 2025. So Petr studied theoretical and evolutionary biology in the Faculty of Science at Charles University in Prague, and he now works there as an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and the History of Science. Petr has worked on a broad host of different topics in the evolutionary human sciences. He's not only made several contributions to our understanding of facial and vocal attractiveness, inheritance systems, and evolutionary models of homosexuality, but I think he's probably the first new investigator to have published his own children's book and volume of poems, which is quite impressive. And Petr's more recent focus has been on cultural evolution, where he's been developing mathematical models to investigate the impact of the differences between genetic and social transmission on the processes of adaptation and divergence. And I think this is going to be a topic that's the focus of your talk today. And more generally, I think most of us in this room know Petr. His vibrant personality and vast interest in all of the research happening within our community has really made him someone who I, and I expect most others, really look forward to seeing every year at EHBEA. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Petr.
Okay, so in total, this is my 8th EHBEA, I counted. And my first EHBEA was in London, and actually I do this topic that I will present you all the time while, jumping to other topics and issues and stuff like that. So this was my first EHBEA poster, and 2 years later we had to send it for a special seminar on how to do a poster presentation with a graphics designer. And the graphics designer used it as a warning example of how it should not be done, because there is too much information, a lot of text, and most importantly, what she discouraged was this strategy: follow this line, and then just zigzag through the poster. You should follow this line. So don't do it. But at my first EHBEA, there was a new investigator awarded to Olivier Morin. I probably mispronounce it, but yeah. We have a right to mispronounce other people's names. But I was really basically mesmerized by his talk. I have read his book, How Traditions Live and Die. Then I have read more papers on cultural attraction, on culture spaces. So my current talk basically is like a hybridization of this poster and the inspiration that I draw from my first EHBEA. So if I inspire someone else here in this hall, maybe, I don't know, 9 years from now or whatever, we can have another presentation on a similar topic. And in this way, we will have a nice formal example of cultural transmission. Yeah? And also, this is what I will talk about. I would like to model cultural transmission as a close equivalent of biological inheritance, because that's what it really is, and this is like a foundational block of the current cultural evolution field. So let's start with some history. These 3 guys, for example, I'm sure you recognize them, thought, but nobody really formalized it, that inheritance is somehow blending, which means that if you have 2 individuals, their offspring will be their average, right? So it's also called paint pot inheritance, which means that if you mix 2 colors, then you distribute it back, you have 2 offspring which are in parental average, right? The problem is that in such a system, the variation very quickly goes down to 0, right? You just pair people, take their averages, you take their averages. And this is known as swamping argument, and it was proposed by electrical engineer Fleming Jenkins, which we hate because he did it because he was a creationist, he hated evolution, and also there is a mathematical mistake in his argument. But the point is that before this got solved really, somebody came, Gregor Mendel, and he said, okay, it's not blending, come on, it's particulate. He also did research because he hated Darwin, but let's talk about it sometime, at a different occasion maybe. But when you have genetics, there is no blending, and even if you have half the advantage, the half advantage, the one allele, can clearly spread through the population until you will get the critical mass to start reconstructing the homozygotes with this advantage again. But previously, there were other attempts to avoid this swamping problem, like granules. Okay, it's not paint, it's just few balls that you just mix, and then you randomly reallocate them to the bucket, so there will be some differences between the individuals. Darwin liked this. Herbert Spencer had his own version of this argument. Hugo de Vries, who eventually rediscovered Mendelism, was introducing the term mutation originally for a genuinely like system when the new color of a ball kind of emerges. Very interesting. But Darwin started to stress, that there is always a lot of small differences in the population that kind of emerge in every generation, inspired by Francis Galton, my arch nemesis, who basically introduced a nice quantitative model of, body height, whatever, how this is inherited. You probably know the term Galton's fallacy. That's this case where you not only average the parents, but you also need to regress these averages a bit towards the mean. The problem is that he just modeled offspring traits as a function of parental traits, whereas the correct version, when you basically don't need this regression to the mean, is this causal graph, right? There are genes, they influence the traits, there is environment, and it also influences the traits. So Galton-Pearson inheritance model, Pearson emerges, his very famous pupil, just replaces this assumption that offspring are in parental mean with some stochastic term. So let's say there is an error term, and the error term can be characterized like a normal distribution with mean of 0 and some constant standard deviation. So this is the concentration, this is the dispersion. What is really important is that in Galton-Pearson model, there is constant offspring variance independent of parental traits. Let me illustrate. No matter whether the parents are really similar or whether they are really different from each other, when there are enough genes that influence body height or whatever trait in which they differ, they will be characterized by a constant. He did it measuring sweet pea seed size and human height, for example. But a bit later, Gregory Bateson came from the continent and brought the idea of genetics here to this great country, and then they started to accuse each other of cherry picking, right? You pick these stupid pea colors, you pick only these, nonsense quantitative traits like height or shell size or whatever, and there was a big river between these two approaches. And it took Ronald Fisher to basically bridge the gap by showing in this most influential paper of population genetics ever that they can be equivalent. Let me very quickly establish a few terms. We have 3 individuals on this trait axis. It's obvious they can be characterized by arithmetic mean. There are the differences between the means. We take the squares. We take the average square, the mean square, and this is called variance. And when we want to have our favorite standard deviation, we just take the square root of the variance, which is great because if the height is in centimeters, the variance is in centimeters squared, and nobody can really imagine what is happening, so we just do this. We speak about standard deviations. And let me show you a piece of knowledge that, in my opinion, is most underappreciated by an average biologist. When you have a man, and you have a hat, and you have a normal distribution of height, this is the mean, this is the standard deviation, and this is the distribution of hats, on average 30 centimeters standard deviation 5, what is the distribution that will characterize the sum of both, right? It's obvious for the mean. Our brains kind of eat this very easily, that it's just 180 plus 30, that's it. What is the standard deviation? The point is that standard deviation does not behave in additive manner, but variance does behave in additive manner. So when you want to get the standard deviation of the sum, you just take the square, the variance, you add it, it behaves equally additively as the mean, and you take the square root, and you have the standard deviation of the result, yeah? So, and this is exactly what Fisher says in the very beginning of the paper, and this is also the paper that just does not solve the problem of Mendelism versus biometric inheritance. It's the paper that introduces the term variance. So this is like a very common deep root of statistics in general and evolutionary biology. Yeah? So let's call this variance blah 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 to standard deviation squared, take the square root, it's beautiful. And he uses this to show this equivalence. First things first. On every, let's imagine that we just have two kinds of alleles on every locus. The allele either like adds a centimeter or subtracts a centimeter. So these are, both homozygote plus one heterozygote. These are basically all possible meeting points of the parents. And the point is that on level of every locus, it is already true that parental mean is equal to offspring mean. So we have the Galton-Pearson inheritance without the regression to the mean. Beautiful. So what happens with the variance? So let's imagine our prototypical individual whose height is kind of like coded like this, representative number of genes. So in this example, we have basically 32 coin flips to determine the trait of an individual in this population. Yeah? And now let's take a random partner with the representative equal distribution of allele pairs paired to these allele pairs, and let's count where you actually toss only one coin. There are some deterministic offspring pairings, because if both are homozygote, what can come out of this? But at some loci, you toss one coin, and on some loci, you toss two coins, right? And from this representative example, it is obvious that the number of coins that you toss to generate a random offspring of two parents is half of the coin tosses of like the trait determination of a random member of the population, which is awesome because you can just say that population variance is twice the variance, the offspring distribution of an average pair of like random pair of parents. So this agnostic constant eta can be, decomposed to the sum of population variance divided by 2. This asterisk just means after selection, right? Because those who are selected the way they don't reproduce. So population variance after selection divided by 2 plus variance due to new mutations, yeah? And obviously the total population genetic variance will be found at the point where the mutation pressure is basically paired exactly by selection. Beautiful, yeah? So this is kind of Fisher's vision. The genotype is inherited like this, and the environment represents the extra variance not reducible to this kind of like genetic recombination and separation and the new mutations. It is just a source of new irreducible constant variance that causes Galton's fallacy, that causes the need to introduce this regression to the mean component. Yeah? So you probably recognize our founding fathers, Luigi Cavalli-Sforza and Marcus Feldman, who said, okay, this is very simplifying. The genotype is inherited like this. Okay, they have a lot of papers where they basically use this kind of model, and they say, okay, the genotype should be modeled by the Fisher's decomposition model, population variance divided by 2 plus variance due to new mutations, but there is also phenotype inheritance and maybe also like environmental inheritance and everything, all these things influence the phenotype. And they focused mostly on cultural transmission, which is direct, let's say, phenotype to phenotype. So they, in this book that is almost as frequently read as cited, they kind of regress towards the Galton-Pearson model, and they use it to model cultural transmission, yeah? But it's only in half of the book, because they again introduce this discrete continuum schisma. Exactly half of the models are discrete, exactly half of the models are continuous, and there is like no effort to create some unification. And the same is true for this cultural and evolutionary process, fantastic book, I think much better than this one, by Boyd and Richardson. Whereas Dawkins' memetics kind of stands on the discrete shore, and explaining culture by Dan Sperber stands on the focus on continuous shore. Yeah? So where's the bridge? Some people just use this inventory metaphor, you know, we kind of acquire new behaviors and we put them in our inventory or whatever. Some people, especially when they focus on designs, they kind of represent it by a position, right? Like each artifact, or maybe every artifact maker, has a position in this continuous space. I will introduce one more term, maybe this is useless, but the point is that we kind of see the divide. There is an artist and there are artworks, yeah? And when somebody tries to imitate them, they want to create similar artworks, so essentially they also move closer to his position when we judge his position by the artworks, yeah? So this top layer would be called design space, and it's super popular when you kind of express the similarities of arrowheads, or when you express similarities between paintings, actually, yeah? But this underlying level should be labeled culture space in the sense that Sperber uses it, but it's not like super consistent, so, but this will be my dichotomy. And I propose the unity of these things, but I think that the priority should be flipped with respect to biological inheritance. In biological inheritance, Fisher is doing the unity in a way that discrete traits kind of predict the position on continuous axis, continuous traits. But I think that in cultural domain, the continuous trait level should be used to predict discrete behavioral manifestations. So how it can be done, there are many ways. This one is mine, and I think it's nice because it uses autoencoders, which are statistical models, essentially. But it's a type of statistical model that can be really easily implemented by a human brain, right? So data goes in, predictions go out. They should be as similar as possible. But this layer, the code layer, is very effective compression of the data, and usually it's perfectly continuous. So we have some individuals, and the autoencoder can read like these non-simple either-or things, like whether you drink coffee, tea, or both, or none, whether you commute by car or whether you bike to work, whether you don't have a guitar, you have one guitar, and then there is nothing in between, then you have dozens of guitars and you don't know how many you have, right? So this is kind of like ordinal variable, but it's not a problem for the autoencoder. You can even put some quantitative traits, like what is the average length of a poetry that you publish, whatever. It can be very long, doesn't matter, even more, yeah? So the network can easily learn from observations, like this is the behaviors that go in, this is predictions that go out, and they should match. And you go through these individuals, and you end up with autoencoder, and then when you see somebody is just drinking coffee and you don't know anything else, the network will activate and it will automatically light up this node in the direction that predicts that this person commutes by car. Yeah? Like most autoencoders that machine learning experts are using are regular. You can see that it's not symmetric, that it's kind of like different in the encoder and decoder part. But I really like tight weights autoencoder because this is like super easily implementable by brain based on the maxima that what fires together wires together, and it's just like mutual activation. You only need half of the network for this. This is the network, unactivated, just learned on previous data. You show the autoencoder the coffee, and now the ball, you basically play against the wall. The ball travels in your brain. Yeah? Another layer, this is the code layer, the continuous representation of who this person is. Yeah? And then the signal gets back. And when it reaches, you basically cannot resist by also like activating the nodes that assume that this person also drives to work. Yeah, so this is completely just speculation, but all my money currently are on autoencoder with tight weights. Yeah? So how it works, there is like this lady, And she's asking, what should I do culture-wise? Yeah? So she has some autoencoder in her brain, and the deep layer, the codes, are basically equivalent to positions in some latent feature space. Yeah? So he sees first guy, okay, some activation, it creates a position, second guy, third guy, and then she maybe thinks, I should be different from all these individuals, which is, again, really simple. You just add a naive node, you position yourself somewhere else than everybody else is. Okay, maybe you try to be a bit like the yellow guy, but also different from everyone else. Yeah? So I want to be a bit like the yellow guy, but also in this direction, I want to be elsewhere than everyone else. And then you just wire it to the rest of your network, and it predicts maybe slightly unique combination of behaviors. Yeah. Fantastic. And these behaviors become a learning material for the next cultural agents. So this is the first one. There are two others. They are similar age, so they kind of, all their lives, they also like excite each other and redefine a bit each other's culture space representation. And then maybe there is a next generation and they learn from these three. Yeah. What is interesting is that when she tries to predict behavior of this guy, she can be quite precise, but the problem is when this guy later in life, when the encoder network of this lady is no longer plastic enough, when he introduces a novel behavior that cannot be easily reduced by connections within this network, like he becomes the Batman or whatever, she will completely ignore this information because she does not have the network trained for paying attention to this kind of behaviors, all these weird combinations of behaviors. And I call this a boomer brain fallacy, and I think it's caused by decreasing plasticity of this encoding network because, for example, in my country that has a communist past, these fantastic young people are encoded by some boomers as similar to these gerontocratic idiots, right? And they say, no, what the fuck? Yeah. But that's the problem. The networks differ, yeah? And this is the cause. Currently, let's assume that we don't know anything about the brain because it's kind of a true, but this can be a super useful model of cultural transmission in general, right? We can assume that below each of these representations, it does not exist, but it's a super useful approximation. It's like some culture space, the culture space, and every other of these heuristic personal culture spaces can be modeled as this culture space with maybe rotated, reflected, and translated, right? Plus some random multidimensional noise, which can easily be constant, right? So we can learn a lot by modeling just the culture space, and probably it may ring a bell, especially in the French part of the audience, that something similar was done computationally in 1960s and 70s by Pierre Bourdieu and by his students and friends, that you just ask a lot of questions and then you use maybe a different method than autoencoder, but you reduce all these variabilities between people to a single kind of spatial representation, and in this sense, the computer just becomes another actor of the cultural representation and transmission maybe, but it can be too represented as this original culture space, reflected, translated, and rotated, plus some random noise. There's no difference between computer representation and our model representation in the brain. And this is very similar to what Spotify is doing when it's trying to suggest you a new song, or what Netflix is doing, right? And we can learn a lot by just modeling the culture space. Yeah? And I want to stress this. In genetics, what caused the divide when they were accusing each other of cherry picking? The point is that when we translate the discrete layer to whatever, sometimes we are lucky and it will correspond nicely. Sometimes we are not. Sometimes we are even less lucky when the continuous trait level, like predisposition to a mental disorder or something like that, predicts whether the mental disorder really triggers or not, right? So there can be like more layers upon this. And in the same way, when we model things using the culture space, sometimes we are lucky when some subset of the culture space dimensions project nicely onto the design space. Yeah. But sometimes we are not lucky and we invent memetics. Yeah. But the problem is that we are very frequently unlucky because when you have like this culture space and this kind of the color, the archipelago of color encodes the information whether the person will vote for Poseidon in the next election or whether they will vote for Zeus, a lot of the predictive capacity just goes away. But at the same time, it allows us to formalize and speculate about that this is the reason why if you just vote for Poseidon for similar reasons as your role models, you are quite likely to vote for Poseidon as well. But if your role models, each of them votes for Zeus for different reasons, you can more easily likely vote for Poseidon. Yeah? Because there is just some granularity of the culture space that makes sense. So my opinion is that Cavalli, Sforza, and Feldman should have gone all the way, and they should basically discard this model. I have a lot of time. I will make it on time. People, this is great news. Because basically, they did not just like pull the model out of their nose. They measured their way towards this model by measuring genetically inherited traits. So it's not really surprising that they have arrived to something that can be easily decomposed in the Fisherian way. Yeah? So of course this is like the genetic component of the trait. Yeah? We did not introduce the extra environment thing that causes the Galton's fallacy. But thanks to the additivity of variance, we can just take this common standard deviation expression and we can divide it into two terms. Yeah? One term is due to recombination and separation of the alleles, and one term is just one new normal distribution is due to new mutations. And then we can introduce the environment, and we will have a third term, the third normal distribution in this equation, all of them constants, independent of parental traits, right? So why all these terms use this constant standard deviation? And the thing is, and many people don't realize this, because all these terms only act on individual level, either on the level of like individual parent, recombination and separation, on the level of individual allele, mutation or not, and then the environment influences just the offspring. Yeah? So there is no integration of information from multiple sources in neither of these random terms. But the point is that this is not a good idea for cultural transmission. And let me tell you a story that will be very palatable for your intuition. A story of an ancestor. Yeah? We have our ancestor, he would like to take up a spear hunting, and he doesn't know what a spear looks like. So he approaches two prestigious individuals. You can notice the purple toga, right? And he just observes which strategies they use. One is using very short spears, one is using long spears. Okay, so he will end up somewhere in between. But his friends visit the same two individuals, and he ends up with a strategy slightly closer to this guy. Yeah? Third, fourth, fifth, and the Galton-Pearson model would force us to believe that even if they are very homogeneous, the distribution of apprentices is the same. And we all feel that this is nonsense, right? When you have homogeneous cultural parents, you should expect homogeneous cultural outputs, and heterogeneous parents should predict heterogeneous outputs. Yeah? We can express this by a related model. We just use this other constant, which I really like to call ni, because it looks like v, which is like variation or whatever. But the point is that here, for example, the standard deviation of offspring depends linearly on the standard deviation of parents. Yeah, so the variance would depend on ni squared, right? But it's not that important. The point is that this model expects exactly this with proportion ni, small variation of parents, small variation of offspring, huge variation of parents, huge variation in offspring. But what is more parsimonious? What is more like constant? And the answer is it's equal, because here you have the constant in absolute terms, right? But here you have a constant proportion of offspring that fall between parental values, right? Homogeneous, heterogeneous in this example with ni equal to 1, it's always 68% or something. Yeah. So let's focus on the Fisher's terms and let's ask ourselves, are they really error terms? Yeah, because in the original terminology, when Cavalli-Sforza and Feldman write the formula with E, they think about like error term, but we think only about mutation as an error. We kind of think about this recombination and separation. These are alleles that already, survive the test of time, so they can recombine and separate to create maybe new beneficial phenotypes. So I term this term exploration term. And what is this? It's just like environment doing things. Sometimes it's beneficial because the organism learns about its environment. Sometimes it's not beneficial because it's just like developmental plasticity going wild and suddenly you have a problem. Yeah. So I term it just a noise term, and the reason is because it presents noise for selection. For selection, this is noise that prevents to efficiently select phenotypes from genotypes. Yeah? And we already spoke about the noise in the culture space versus the personal heuristic culture space. I'm looking for a better term. If you have one, please approach me after the presentation. But this can be modeled as multivariate random noise. So perfect, we have our noise term. We should also now just say that we are just talking about offspring and about parents. There is no distinction between genotype and phenotype. No regression to the mean, or its equivalent, is going to save us in cultural transmission. It already can be seen in this equation. In cultural transmission, we can expect chaotic increases in variance. We can expect variance loss, even if it's super maladaptive. It's just positive feedback between variance and variance, right? So, but this thing that offspring is expected to resemble parental mean can be called the inspiration term, the inspiration standpoint, starting point, right? So this thing, the noise, can be attributable to differences between individual heuristics. This error term is that even when you try to be exactly in the mean of people that inspired you, you will be imprecise. This is the error, but obviously you don't want to be exactly in the mean of your role models. You try to explore the space a bit, try to find perhaps a free niche. So innovation is again not a perfect term because we kind of tend to think about innovation only when we are outside of the range kind of anchored by the cultural parental values. But the point is that our intuition can sometimes betray us. The reason why people sometimes overstep the range of people that inspire them is because there is this stochastic term, and within the stochastic term, there is no difference between innovation and inspiration, for example. Yeah? Oh, no, inspiration is this. So what is it? Like innovation and like being confused. Yeah? This is the same. But it's different from error and from noise. Yeah? And I have two arguments for variance proportionality for the thing with the arrows. And what's beautiful about it, and I realized this just recently, is that each argument is connected to only one of these stochastic terms. So argument one, wow, okay, it didn't go well. I didn't click so far when I was testing this. Whoops. It's the imprecise mean estimation argument. I have a task for you. Stand in between of the lines on the screen. Okay, let's do it. Okay. There is some error, yeah? And now, stand halfway between this line, okay, and the Big Bang. Okay? Expecting that the imprecision will be the same in absolute terms from the previous case, that's obvious nonsense. But this is what is assumed when you say that there should be a constant error term. We have some data collected with these two brilliant students within their school. It was a high school project. The task basically is try to make a point on a paper between these 2 points. And there was a lot of data. A lot of people did this. I call this is the simplest experiment that has never been done before. And I also had it in my grant proposal, and none of the reviewers believed that it was not done before, but nobody was able to provide a citation. So when I just plot the data, these are the distances on the paper, it's quite obvious. I can formalize it better, show you these regions. It's obviously variance proportional. What is kind of interesting in this case is that people tend to deviate more in the direction perpendicular to the direction that they focus on. Yeah? But don't focus on this. This is like big overview presentation. Yeah. So you believe me that the error term should be variance proportional in culture, right? Yeah. So argument 2, yeah, it's linked to the exploration term, and it's argument of implicit fitness landscape inference. I think to this audience I don't need to introduce the fitness landscape very much. Just you have some trait values, and the fitness is a function of the trait value. Sometimes it's beneficial to be small because you can hide. Sometimes it's beneficial to be big because you can fight the predator, but it's not a good idea to be in between, right? And when you just see the hypothetical cultural parents, you can assume that there is some narrow peak between them if they are similar to each other. Especially when there is a lot of them, it's almost certain, right? But when you see successful individuals that are very different from each other, you can assume that the landscape is like this stable mountain, or maybe this, or maybe each of them is climbing different hill, or maybe this is this like rugged, narrow-peaked space or whatever. But in all of these cases, it's better to differ from the parental mean more, the more the parents are different. And for me, it is striking, and I have even a theory why that is. You can ask me during the coffee break. Why genetic inheritance or biological inheritance opted out from using the information of parental variance. Yeah? This is probably not the case when you see a lot of different behaviors being successful. So, yeah. We see this in culture. When people are constrained by reality, they tend to all make the same behaviors, right? And then they start creating fiction, and they create fictional swords, yeah? They are similar to each other, but suddenly somebody macro-innovates, and then the variance of inputs is proportional to the variance of outputs, and we end up with this very, very fast. We have a study for this done in Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology with the Mosaic group, Oleg Sobchuk and Brett Beheim, and we used this like 300-dimensional embeddings of books from the Hathi Trust. It was done by Oleg and Artyom Shera for a different project, but we just co-opted it for a study of proportionality of variance. And each book now is embedding in a 300-dimensional design space, and then we kind of assume that there is nice and neat, projection of the culture space to the design space or whatever. But we can say that there is like a role model, Agatha Christie, starting from modern criminal fiction. And there is like the first generation of famous followers, of famous epigons. And they are kind of like, even in a PC2 space, done in this, they are similar to each other. And we can have a sci-fi, yeah, you have H.G. Wells, and then you have the other famous guys. They kind of each is exploiting slightly different part of the PC1, PC2 principal component space, but in this 300 dimension, it is quite similarity than to Agatha Christie and the criminal fiction. And we can just calculate the distances between role models and these epigons on all the dimensions and represent the distribution of these distances. And you can kind of see that, okay, criminal fiction writers are more similar to Agatha Christie, sci-fi writers are more similar to H.G. Wells. But we can do something similar and check whether how much variance proportional are these epigons along each of these dimensions, and we see kind of high numbers, like this is for Agatha Christie, this is for H.G. Wells. It is variance proportional, but obviously the point is that some dimensions tend to be more exploited in general and some can be exploited less in general, so this is not sufficient. What is sufficient is pairwise comparison, right? Is Agatha Christie's epigon more variance proportional on this dimension than if we modeled all these like A.G. Wells epigons as followers of Agatha Christie, and we see exactly this. There is increase in variance proportionality with our assumed expert knowledge assignment of these groups of people to certain role models in literature. So being someone's epigons doesn't just mean resembling them, but it also means exploring the same dimensions in the culture space. Yeah? But we are kind of lacking the simple elegance of just measuring sweet pea seed size, or at least we were. But we have created the tip for science, which is a game that Pavlína Hillerova from my group designed. And the point is that there are questions like, how many balloons does it take to lift a pig? Yeah? Okay? And we can kind of assume that, fine, these are kind of behaviors that some previous players did. Yeah, so it kind of neatly projects on some dimensions in the culture space. This lady will eventually inspire and come up with some behaviors of her own, but because she doesn't know anything about it, we will quite clearly see what is the variance proportionality along this dimension. And if it rings a bell, it's quite similar and it's rooted in the same kind of expertise and inspiration sources as this like beast proposal by Lukas Moleman from Germany. Yeah? But they don't have exactly like just see these things and guess your own point, right? So this is the question, there will be some answer, and we can ask whether there is variance proportionality. We can also ask whether there is mean proportionality, whether people rather differ by 10% than by some constant. We can combine all these models. We can ask about conformity. The reason why we don't speak about conformity in biological transmission is that there are always two parents, and there is nothing like conformity if you have just two individuals. Yeah? But if you have like this situation that one guy is different from two other role models, whether it shifts the mean against the assumed mean that would be without conformity, there is nice parametrization of it. The parametrization doesn't overreact to introduction of a third similar individual. It just reacts proportionally to the information in the third individual, which is great. And we can also ask about guided variation. Like, are people more likely to diverge from the parental mean towards the correct answer, towards the optimum? It would look like this, yeah? More attraction are these points, less attraction would be, or less guided variation. It's the same, it's basically the same term numerically. And the results on logarithms of these answers, which makes the analysis more elegant, is this. Okay, there is a lot of information, but the best model contains everything, yeah? And it's because we need to shield away from effectively uniparental models. The thing is that if you just pick one randomly, and you just deviate constantly from this picked one randomly parent, you would see some illusory variance proportionality, right? Because these hills would be just more far away. So we really want to know whether there is integration of this parental information, or whether it is just pick one and no integration. And obviously, the models with integration of the information are much better than these models, yeah? So one by one, proportionality of variance, it's there. Conformity, it's there, but not much. Let me zoom in, like this is the conformity. It's obviously statistically significant, but it's not huge. Guided variation, it's there. Again, not so strong. Like these are the compatibility intervals. It's somewhere between these values in our system. If you want to cooperate, we can just get in touch and you can translate the questions and run it in your own population. Yeah? So, implications. When we start doing simulations, we have population here. We evaluate how far they are from the optimum. We let only the fittest survive. We procreate them randomly. We kind of get some result of computer simulation. We see if it's Galton-Pearson model, this what I called the hockey stick adaptation. Yeah? It's linear and then it stays there. Yeah? When we replace it with variance proportionality, we see kind of more interesting behavior. We see this punctuality with long periods of no change or short period of rapid adaptation. We did this simulation, and when we compare adaptation in small and large population, this is super interesting. If it's just Galton-Pearson inheritance, the population size plays no role. It's equally quick in small and large population, yeah? But when it's variance proportional, small population, other parameters stay the same. No adaptation, large population, exponentially fast adaptation during directional selection. Yeah? So when we ask this question, how all this new behavioral modernity started, whether we attribute it to some symbolic revolution due to new adaptations, or whether we just attribute it to higher population density, there is ongoing discussions about this. There are people who say bigger populations means more adaptation, and there are people who say, look, it happens at different population densities for Africa and for Australia, so it's not the same. But in our simulation, sometimes it looks like this, sometimes it looks like this, from the same starting condition. So it's not deterministic, but still bigger populations predict bigger adaptations. And obviously, it's never explicitly stated, but from how Francis Galton presents his results, it's obvious that he was considering more models of transmission originally, and the variance proportional transmission was among them. So I should probably wear this t-shirt. Yeah? It happens all the time. And the last result is that variance proportionality also allows to explain how this emerges from this. Yeah? Everybody is just finding a friend, and they move along the vector randomly, either variance proportional or not variance proportional. We can combine the model into one, our very favorite additive variance thing, and people can pair heterogamously, or then they can exhibit homogamy. They prefer self-similar role models, already self-similar role models, and when all these things are in place, including proportional variance, you see emergence of subcultures. But here, where there is a huge influence of constant variation, we see nothing like that. So biological species emerge difficultly, urban subcultures emerge easily, and I think it's because of the difference in variance proportionality. We don't even need this coordination thing, and maybe it causes easier speciation and diversification of cultural animals, like in humans, where when you have long and predictable growth season, you have a lot of languages, just the spontaneous emergence of subcultures goes berserk, yeah? And it requires scarcity to glue these small subcultures back together to bigger subcultures, which is consistent with this paper, but this should be considered the default, and this is also what is happening in affluent Western society, where we really just like scatter into these subcultures. And this is it. I made it, sorry for the overtime, thanks to all these famous, fantastic co-authors, and I'm happy to take any questions.